Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links deck profile. Today we are taking a look at the new Royal Rebel deck using the new skill Hell Tuning Invasion. So a lot of people have been saying they think this deck might be tier 0, they think it's the best deck in the game. And again, I'm still undecided on where I really think this is. My impression is this is probably the strongest deck in the game right now, but it's not completely unbeatable. The deck still can brick, and it does have a couple of specific counters which, although they're not reliable counters, they still can pull games off of this deck. I guess any deck can, as long as this deck either bricks or if they get the God Hand anyway, but this deck is definitely one of the strongest decks in the game. The first thing we're going to do is take a look at our skill, and this skill seems to do absolutely everything. So it can only be used if the only monsters with 1400 or more attack in your deck are light attribute fiend type. Requirement: send one card from my hand to the graveyard. All monsters on either field become face-up attack position until the end of this turn. The level of all level 4 or lower fiend-type monsters on your field becomes 5. The level of all level 5 or higher monsters on your opponent's field decreased by 4. This turn you cannot attack with monsters that are level 6 or lower. So, this skill is a bit nuts. So first off, we have to send a card from our hand to the graveyard. Now generally that's a bad thing. We don't really want to be discarding, but in exchange for everything this skill does, that is quite a small price to pay. All monsters on either field become face up. So just becoming face up is already incredible. That means all of our Royal Rebel effects can now affect those monsters because they are no longer face down, which is basically the way that you've always in the past been able to counter the Royal Rebels, is just set a bunch of cards because they don't really do anything to set cards. So flipping them up, already really good. But not only are they face up, they are in attack position, which means now we can attack over them if we want to and just get to our opponent's life points, which is pretty good. This doesn't actually come up very often, as we'll talk about in a minute, but that is something. Until the end of the turn, the level of all level 4 or lower fiend monsters on your field becomes 5. Now that is extremely important because that now means triggering our Royal Rebel Tribute Monsters effects becomes very, very easy. We can get either Invasion or Heavy Metal very, very easily every single turn. And the level of all level 5 or higher monsters on your opponent's field decrease by 4. That means any of their level 8 and lower monsters now get popped by Invasion, which is absolutely insane. This means sometimes we will be lowering the level of our opponent's strongest monsters to be their lowest or tied for lowest level on the field, which means if we do use our Royal Rebels Heavy Metal, we can actually pop their big monster, so like a Dragus for example, and then gain 2500 attack even though our opponent has other face-up weaker monsters, which can be unbelievably impactful. On top of the fact maximum monsters get decreased in level by 4 as well, making them level 6, which means although they still will dodge Invasion, they no longer dodge Heavy Metal, which means we have an in-archetype way to out-maximum monsters, not only out them, but also steal their attack points, which is absolutely insane and can create these ridiculous OTK scenarios. So a couple of things to take note of. This turn, you cannot attack with monsters that are level 6 or lower. That basically means anything that we have that was level 4 or lower that got pushed up to 5 is not obviously above 6, so nothing else can attack, which is fine because this skill needs some sort of restriction. On top of the fact, we need to flip something face up to use this skill. So if our opponent only has face up monsters, we need to set one of our fiend monsters and then flip it up using our skill to actually get this skill to work. This has happened to me a few times where I've actually forgotten that this monster does need to be flipped up for this skill to actually resolve, so it just didn't work and I lost a few games because of that. But outside of that, this skill is pretty foolproof and it does everything the deck needs it to do. So let's have a look. We have Royal Rebels Heavy Metal. This is one of our primary boss monsters of the deck. So during the turn you normal summon this card by attributing a level 5 or higher monster. Choose one face-up level 8 or lower monster with the lowest level on your opponent's field. This card gains attack equal to that monster's attack until the end of this turn. Destroy that monster. So we get to gain a load of attack and pop our opponent's monster. This card is completely bonkers, and we're primarily going to want to see this in the maximum matchup because this is the only in-archetype way we have to actually deal with maximum monsters, because although we do have our other boss monster in Rebels Invasion, this is the one we want to see all the rest of the time. So if we're not against maximums, we just want to be seeing Invasion again and again and again, which is during the turn you normal summon this card by attributing 2 level 5 or higher monsters, destroy all face-up level 4 or lower monsters on your opponent's field. Again, because of our skill, as long as our opponent doesn't have a maximum, all of their monsters will be level 4 or lower, which is really, really powerful because we get to blow up our opponent's board and then attack them directly. Next up, we have Curry Bots. This is just a small little advantage engine. It's specifically good in here because it's a fiend, which means it does work with our skill. So requirement, if we have no other monsters on our field, we can pay 500 life points to add a Curry Bot from our graveyard to our hand. And this is really, really important because Royal Rebels in general generally discard a lot of cards or tribute off a lot of cards. So they end up using a lot of cards and a lot of resources to actually get their game plan going, which doesn't actually leave them with a lot. So having any way to plus is always going to be really, really important. And Currybot does just that. Next up, we're on one copy of Rising Light Angel Essel. This card is basically in here just a high roll if we're going second. During the turn, you have not special summoned a monster. Send the top 2 cards of your deck to the graveyard. Then, if you activate this effect during the first turn of the player going second, which means if we're going second and it's our first turn, we can special summon one monster from either player's graveyard face up to our field. So this is primarily, again, just a way to plus. We just want to get an extra monster on the board. The main issue with this card is it is a fairy and not a fiend, which means its level will not be increased, which means we only really want this card to be a chump blocker, or we want it to be tributed alongside a fiend monster to get out Royal Rebels Heavy Metal to trigger its effect, which is why we've cut this down to 1. We were originally playing 3 Essel, but its effect wasn't coming off enough that it was really popping off. I think there was one game where we got to cheat out a Royal Rebels Invasion on turn 1, which was very, very cool. But overall, this card feels like it's really useful when it does work, but we don't want to max out on it because we don't want to be seeing it all the time, especially if we go first. This card just basically does nothing. Next up, a really insane support card for the Fiends. This is Shadow Buyer. We can shuffle one monster from our graveyard into the deck, and this is actually a very important requirement because this lets us recycle our boss monsters. This lets us put Heavy Metal and Invasion back into our deck so we can draw them out in following turns and keep the game plan going, which is very, very important. But we can increase this card's level by the number of face-up monsters on your opponent's field until the end of this turn. You can only attack with Fiend monsters this turn, that's fine, we don't really care about that requirement, but increasing this card's level is very important because we can get this guy up to level 5 very, very easily, which means we can tribute out Royal Rebels Heavy Metal, get its effect off without using our skill, which in some situations is a lot better because that means we can still attack with our lower level monsters, which is really, really good. Now in the future, when we get monsters that require level 7s to be tributed to get their effects off, like Doom Metal, Shadow Buyer will also increase in value, but this card is basically going to be a staple pretty much forever in Fiend decks. Next up, another ridiculous support card, Cobalt. So send a Fiend monster from your hand to the graveyard, draw 1 card. This is a type of effect that a lot of different types in the game get, and it's very surprising to me that Fiend got theirs so early. It seems to me like Konami really wants to push Fiends to be a very powerful deck. Just filtering is, in general, is just really, really good. Being able to discard if we have too many bricks, too many high levels in our hand, we can draw. If we're in a very desperate situation we're going to lose anyway, we also might as well use its effect to discard any of our other weaker monsters to hope that we draw into one of our boss monsters, which is always really, really good and gives you an out where otherwise you would have just lost the game. So any kind of filtering like this is always really, really good. Next up, we have 2 Nessus the Star Knight. Now again, these slots don't matter so much because for the most part, all of our lower level monsters are going to be just fodder to be tributed using our skill to get out our bigger monsters. But again, in the niche situations where we will not be using our skill, having 1500 attack monsters is still pretty good. We can summon these alongside our high levels and just attack in, and it generally just having aggro monsters is still considered a good thing. Next up, we are on 3 Babysitter Goat and 3 Descendant of Titans. The reason we are on these is basically for the trap card King's Majesty. So we'll talk about King's Majesty a little bit later, but Babysitter Goat is a level 1, 0 attack, 1400 defense. This can be very, very important in the mirror, because if our opponent flips up all of our cards and they do not have Invasion, Royal Rebels Heavy Metal can only pop Babysitter Goat because it's level 1, it will always be the lowest monster on the field, which means if they pop this, they don't gain any attack, which can be pretty good, whereas Descendant of Titans has 1000 attack, which means it's better if we actually want to attack with it, or if we want to use it to chump block. If, for example, Harpies flip it up and then we have to take some damage. If they flip over a Babysitter Goat, we take full damage. If they flip over the Descendant of Titans, we take minus 1000 damage. So depending on the matchup, these cards kind of flip around and which one is better. But we've maxed out on 6 of them for a specific reason, which we will talk about in a minute. Next up, we have Tribute to the Doomed. Now, Legend spells, they're all pretty good in this deck, realistically. Shield and Sword into specifically the Mirror and against Cyburst and a lot of the Harpy cards, a lot of these cards have 0 defense, which means a lot of the time we will just be able to straight up kill them with a Shield and Sword play. But this deck kind of has its own game plan. I feel like we don't need to do that because we're basically going to try and wipe our opponent's entire board and get in for a direct attack every turn anyway, which then leaves us with 2 major options, that being Tribute to the Doomed and Monster Reincarnation. Monster Reincarnation is a fantastic card. We can use it to bring back Heavy Metal or bring back Invasion, which is very important in a lot of the matchups, especially the mirror, because this deck's game plan is to summon one of our big tribute monsters every single turn and just keep that going and going and going. And it basically oppresses our opponent. We pop the whole board, we get in for a direct attack. But this deck still does have a problem with maximum monsters. Now, if we have Royal Rebels Heavy Metal, that's fine. We can out the maximum monster quite easily as long as we're not immediately dead. And if we have Monster Reincarnation Heavy Metals in our graveyard, we can also get back Heavy Metal and we can just destroy it. But if we don't have Heavy Metal in our graveyard and we don't have Heavy Metal in our hand, we need a backup strategy to be able to out the maximum. So Tribute to the Doomed is my go-to. I don't necessarily think this is the best card for this slot, but both of our legend spells do discard a card anyway. The main issue here again is the discard. We don't really want to be discarding because then it makes it very difficult for us to use all of our other effects, because our skill also requires a discard, and then we have to tribute 2 monsters to get our big guys out. So Tribute to the Doomed, again, is my go-to just because I'm very paranoid about not being able to out maximums. But realistically, this could be anything. This could be Monster Reincarnation, this could be Shield and Sword, or we could even forego a legend altogether if we wanted to, and just play Talismanic Seal Array, which also does sort of out maximums depending on the graveyard setup. Next up, we have 3 Ghost Cyclone. And again, this could easily just be the Genie's Fire Breath. I personally like the Ghost Cyclone because I like to try and high roll it and get it when I've got the 3 or less cards in graveyard. This will let us draw 1 additional card, which again, plussing in this deck is so important. A lot of the time, especially in the mirror, we'll be sitting across from our opponent and we will just be summoning out one of our big guys, and that'll be all we can really accomplish, maybe set a back row, and then we're always vulnerable to our opponent slapping down a Heavy Metal, popping our either Heavy Metal or Royal Rebels Invasion, and getting in for a ton of damage. So just having the extra card from Ghost Cyclone means we can set alongside it a Cobalt Kobold or a Shadow Buyer, which does protect us from just getting completely killed by Heavy Metal, because generally Heavy Metal will have to pop one of our other monsters, especially if it's one of our weaker monsters, which means it will not gain any attack, which means then it will be unable to clear our 2500 attack Heavy Metal, which again does come up, and the mirror is very important because this deck is everywhere on ladder. The other thing about Ghost Cyclone is it's very important to have spell trap destruction, because the trap cards are what really make or break the mirror match, and that is Widespread Ruin and King's Majesty. The reason these cards are very important is because these are traps that can stop an attack when we have no monsters, which means if our opponent does get out their Invasion or their Royal Rebels Heavy Metal, destroy our entire board, and then attack us directly for a crap ton of damage and sometimes ending the game, we need a way to stop them, and that is the Widespread and the King's Majesty, which is why we've maxed out on our level 1s, because we want King's Majesty to be live as often as possible. So we need to be running the back row hate to deal with our opponent's trap cards, and we need to see our trap cards and have them online as much as possible. Again, just for any matchup, but primarily the mirror, these are the best cards in the game to actually deal with the Royal Rebels. So it's funny that I think the best counter to this deck is arguably itself, just because we have ways to interact with our opponent after they've wiped our entire board using an invasion, or after they've wiped out a big monster with a Heavy Metal. So trap cards, very important in this deck. So overall, this deck is bonkers. It does everything it needs to do, and it does it quite well. But this deck still can brick. We can just see all of our high level monsters, or most of them, quite early, and have no plays to make, or just be able to summon out one of our big guys and then have no follow-up. Also, we can just draw a handful of spell traps, which is why we've tried to play as few as possible, really, while still having enough to be able to do what we need to do. We can also brick in the opposite way as well, which is when we draw none of our high levels and we are just unable to do anything. If we just set 3 and our opponent just summons out Invasion, pops our board, we draw a new hand, and once again we just have to set 3 monsters, we are in terrible spot and we can just lose because of that. So although this deck is very powerful and arguably the best deck in the game right now, it is definitely not infallible, it is not foolproof, and it can definitely still lose games. The one other little thing I want to talk about is the mirror match. So the Royal Rebels mirror match is very swingy. I feel like there's not much skill involved and there's not much interaction. The only real interaction you really get to have is Widespread Ruin and King's Majesty, and a lot of the time it will come down to, do one of the players see their boss monsters and the other one doesn't, or if both players do find their boss monsters, who has the back row and the back row hate to deal with it. If one player finds King's Majesty and Widespread Ruin, whereas the other player does not, generally the player that found those trap cards is going to win. And In the same way, if one player finds all of their back row hate and the other player doesn't, and they manage to pop both their opponent's trap cards, that player is probably in a really good position to win. So again, this mirror specifically, I think is extremely luck-based and very, very swingy. So I'm not the biggest fan of it, but if you do like fast-paced, you like aggression, you like quick games, you like blowing up the board, you like getting big attack monsters, this is going to be the deck for you. It is very, very fun a lot of the time, and I do really, really enjoy playing it. So let's fire in some replays so I can show you what I've been talking about.